So last year around this time, I did a video covering Netflix's adaptation of One Piece, talking about what it did right, what it did wrong, and the interesting choices it made in the complicated pursuit of adaptation. Overall, I was quite satisfied with how it turned out, capturing the spirit of One Piece's world and characters while finding its own ways to express them in a new medium. Now we're going to talk about Amazon's attempt to do the same with Sega's hit video game series Ryoga Gotoku, or as it's known in the West, Yakuza. For those unfamiliar, Yakuza is a series dating all the way back to the PlayStation 2, one largely focusing on the main character of Kazuma Kiryu and his life in and around the Yakuza.
The Japanese mafia?
Balancing crime thriller melodrama with some of the most insane action you could ever imagine, the Yakuza series has worked its way into the pantheon of iconic video game series in these last 2 decades. I mean, when a series regularly has a climax involving 2 men fistfighting shirtless at the top of a skyscraper, what's not to love? That's media for the masses. In the last few years, the series has even escaped its niche Japanese game status and gained a substantial following in the West, with each new entry now selling well over 1 million units. So it was only a matter of time before a big studio would eventually come knocking, looking to cash in with an adaptation. This, of course, brings us to the announcement of Like a Dragon: Yakuza earlier this year, a 6-episode miniseries set to release on Amazon Prime this fall, adding another to the storied history of attempted Yakuza adaptations over the years. However, before we put the screws to Amazon's newest adaptation, I first wanted to interrogate why Yakuza in particular was chosen for this miniseries treatment, because it's an interesting decision. Frequently when we get the announcement of yet another video game property getting a live-action adaptation, it typically results in one of 3 outcomes. 1, it wallows in development hell for decades before it's quietly forgotten about. 2, it gets released and is met with a resounding, yeah, that was pretty alright, I guess. Or 3, it gets released and kills anyone who watches it like it's the Ark of the Covenant. Shout out to Eli Roth.
I wanted a movie that you just feel great at the end of it.
Long story short, there isn't exactly a strong legacy of great live-action portrayals of video game properties. I doubt I'm breaking anyone's brain with that comment. Only very recently have we started to see shows break this mold. And even then, we're still getting plenty of misses along the way. But here's where I throw a bit of a curveball. I think Yakuza is a fitting choice for adaptation. If you were going to pick any video game series to do a live-action interpretation of, there are worse picks than Yakuza. I'd even go so far as to say that it makes perfect sense. Where a lot of video game adaptation announcements are usually followed by some version of, how the fuck are they going to adapt that? Yakuza is a fairly cut and dry translation. Outside of the heat moves that would definitely kill the average human being, and wacky sub-stories where you fight a group of gangsters that are into diaper play, God, I can't believe the next sentence that's going to follow that. At its core, Yakuza is a series grounded in reality. Stripping back all the wacky nonsense, Yakuza is a classic crime drama series. It's about family, it's about honor, it's about what it means to be a good person in a bad situation. Fundamentally, these are relatable human stories. In fact, before getting into game development, the creator of the series, Toshihiro Nagoshi, originally wanted to be a filmmaker. And nowhere is that more apparent than in the Yakuza series. The cinematography, the story pacing, the fight choreography, this series was built from the ground up as a Yakuza movie simulator. The world and tone are influenced by movies like Sympathy for the Underdog and the works of Beat Takeshi. Hell, much of the cast in the Yakuza series is based on and performed by screen actors. It wasn't exactly a coincidence that half the characters modeled after Japanese actors are all ones famously known for playing Yakuza in film. If anything, a live-action adaptation sort of brings everything full circle. To go one step further in my pitch, the setting is also a freebie. Yakuza is entirely set in real-life Japan. Kamurocho, the main locale that the series is set around, is just Kabukicho in Shinjuku, Japan. Though it might be difficult to film there for actual Yakuza reasons. And the world building, that's already done for you too. Yakuza is often written to reflect Japan's history and culture during certain periods. Yakuza 0 is centered around the 1980s bubble economy, hence why everyone is literally stuffed with cash. Yakuza 7 is about the crumbling state of the Yakuza in the modern time. And Yakuza Gaiden is agents and... Okay, I stopped playing that one 2 hours in. It's bad. Essentially, if you're building a Yakuza story, you just need to pick a time period and build around that. Honestly, the only hurdle to accurately representing the Yakuza series is how it juggles its tone. If there's anything that Yakuza is known for, it's the masterful way it handles tonal dissonance. Being able to balance sincere, heartfelt moments like Majima and Makoto sharing a moment over some takoyaki, next to Kiryu helping a dominatrix improve her craft. The games often use these isolated sub-stories as a sort of tension relief from the melodrama of the main story. If stuff's getting a little heavy and you need a break, you can always take a few minutes with a mini-story where Kiryu punches a shark. And this sort of approach would be difficult to balance outside of the video game world. When you're confined to a tight hour-and-a-half movie or 6-episode series, you have to be more economical with your time and don't have as much leeway for these goofy one-off adventures that don't tie into the main plot. But if recent shows like One Piece, The Boys, and Fallout have shown us anything, it's that you can fit over-the-top action and ludicrous side characters into your series and still keep general audiences invested. We have empirical evidence that people love shows that aren't afraid of getting a little silly. Obviously, there's a limit to what can be translated into live action. I don't think we can have Saejima doing a DMC combo on a bear, but I don't see why we can't have moments of levity with characters bonding over karaoke, or Majima guessing his way through a bomb defusal. What I'm saying with all this is that, by my calculations, the math for a live-action Yakuza series adds up. It's just a matter of putting all the pieces together. We've already seen previous attempts check off a lot of these boxes, just never all of them together. So that leads us to the inevitable question, how did Amazon do? Well, after watching the series through multiple times and mulling it over for a bit, I think there's only one appropriate way to answer that. Dame dane, dame yo, dame nana yo, anta ga suki de, suki suki te, dore de ke, sui yo sake demo, yuga manai, omoide ga, baka mitai. Okay, so to cut off the comparisons outright, this isn't a Dragon Ball Evolution type of adaptation train wreck, where it only makes sense if the people making it never once looked at the source material and were basing their decisions on what their grandmother knows about the series. No, Like a Dragon: Yakuza is something that could have worked in its own right. There is something salvageable here. I'd even go so far as to say there's some great ideas. It's just that much of the problems lie in all the creative decisions designed to force it to fit in with the other streaming series, resulting in most of the unique qualities of Yakuza being sandblasted off. So less Dragon Ball Evolution and more Resident Evil on Netflix. And I could leave it there. I could just say it's bad and move on with my day. I have a shit ton of other projects I should be procrastinating on. But I have to get these complaints off my chest before I implode. Especially now that the series is getting nominations for Best Adaptation at places like the Game Awards. Yeah, that's right, Jeffrey. You thought nobody would notice you slipping that one through because we all knew Arcane and Fallout were the obvious picks. But I noticed. And one day, you will pay for your sins. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. Sleep with one eye open, Jeffrey. Anyway, now that we're through the preamble, let's rant about Like a Dragon: Yakuza. Alright, to start, the show opens with Kiryu and his friends Nishikiyama, Yumi, and Miho pulling an elaborate heist on a Yakuza Run arcade. Already a weird starting point. If you're familiar with Yakuza, this Ocean's 11 heist aesthetic with the neon-colored nameplates and fast cutting between shots might look out of place. But don't worry, this only comes up once and never again. Get ready for a lot of that. And to give the benefit of the doubt here, this scene does work to establish Kiryu and his friends from scene 1. It shows how Kiryu and Nishiki rely on each other, their group's ability to work as a unit, and the ends they'll go to get enough money to make it out of the orphanage they live in. If this story is about these characters' friendship and the eventual conflict that breaks them apart, there are worse ways to get going. But naturally, stealing from the Yakuza is a bad idea, and before Kiryu and Co. can make off with the cash the next morning, the Yakuza come knocking at their door. Fortunately, the man who runs their orphanage is Kazuma, a former lieutenant for the Dojima family, and out of respect for him, the Yakuza brings the kids in to see the patriarch of their family, Sohei Dojima. After being given a death sentence by the Yakuza, Kiryu pleads with Dojima to spare their lives, as he was the mastermind behind the plan, and it was all in the hopes of getting in front of the patriarch so that he could ask to join the Yakuza. Okay, so I have some notes. Firstly, do you think stealing from the Yakuza is an effective way to get in with the Yakuza? Do you know what the Yakuza is about? Do you know what they do to people who steal from them? Second, before the Yakuza caught them, they were planning to make a run for it. Kiryu had a whole plan to take a bus away from the orphanage that morning that got interrupted because the rest of the gang got caught up making the other kids breakfast. If their plan worked as intended, they would have been out of the orphanage and away from Kazuma. And the only reason they brought Kiryu and Co. in front of Dojima is that Kazuma was there. Otherwise, they probably would have been mutilated and or killed right there. Bad plan, Kiryu, D-. Oh, but what if this was all a lie, I hear some of you saying. He was just making up a story to protect his friends. Well, I'm just gonna let this next bit speak for itself. Okay, Yakuza fans, I'm gonna need you to take a deep breath with me. In, out. Alright, so as we're told, Kiryu as a child attended an underground fight ring. No, we're not told how a child was able to get into an illegal fight club. Shut up. And that's where he saw the Dragon of Dojima, a Dojima family-backed fighter who was the best there ever was. This moment affected Kiryu so much that it inspired him to want to be the next Dragon of Dojima. Now, if you aren't up to date on your Yakuza lore and are wondering why fans of the games are punching their desk right now, this is the first significant change from the source material with major ramifications on the rest of the story. This is the moment I went, oh, this is what we're doing. You see, in the games, Kiryu wanted to join the Yakuza because he admires his adopted father Kazuma to such a degree that he wants to follow in his footsteps, something that Kazuma didn't want for his son, but relents when he realizes he can't stop him from making that decision for himself. In this version, Kiryu hates Kazuma for some reason? General teen angst? I don't know. So now the reason Kiryu wants to join the Yakuza is so that he can be an underground fighter. And the Dragon of Dojima isn't a nickname that Kiryu earned because he's a badass with a dragon tattoo that has earned the respect and admiration of his fellow Yakuza. It's a UFC title that's passed on, along with the dragon back tattoo. Oh, then who's the original Dragon of Dojima, you ask? Don't worry, we'll get there. From this point, the show goes on to bounce between 1995, that being Kiryu's early years with the Yakuza as an underground fighter, and 2005, when Kiryu is released from prison after taking the fall for killing Dojima. This is at the top of the list of the most frustrating creative decisions they made with this adaptation. Not that they changed Kiryu's backstory, but going for that tell the backstory in tandem with the main story to build intrigue plot structure. Like, ooh, what could happen to these friends that they're suddenly not friends in the future? Ooh, mystery. Don't you want to watch more to find out? On paper, this sort of framing isn't an awful idea, but in execution, it is an aggravating watch. Instead of being a retelling of Yakuza 1, what we get is someone taking bits and pieces of Yakuza 0, 1, and 2, along with sprinkles of Judgment for some reason, and mixing them up in a blender in the hopes that it'll end with a coherent story that connects it all together. Unfortunately, what this results in is two lesser plot lines that spend the entire season fighting for the spotlight. And just to be clear, none of my complaints are solely because they dared to make changes to the source material. I'll be the first to say that the story of Yakuza isn't above being adjusted. Dare I say, Yakuza 1 is actually kinda bad by modern standards.
You need to leave!
Look, while it set the foundations for an amazing series, Kiryu's first outing was not well planned out. There are giant leaps in logic, important characters aren't developed, and some things just sort of happen. Basically, a lot of details you can be forgiven for not worrying about when writing a one-and-done story. You see, when Nagoshi and his team were developing the first Yakuza game all the way back in the early 2000s, it was a real Hail Mary pass. At the time, Sega was in a poor spot financially, so they were taking a risk investing in this unproven, high-concept Yakuza simulator Nagoshi was insisting on making. Either it would be a huge success, heralding a new type of action game, or destroy the team's career. So there was no thought about where it would go beyond that one entry. They were pretty much throwing everything at it and seeing what would stick. Ultimately, their gamble paid off in the long run, but it resulted in the series being filled with retcons meant to backfill details not established in the early games. This is why so many characters from the original story weren't fleshed out until either later games revisited them, or the remake of the first game filled in details that were never delved into. What I'm saying is that there's plenty of room to make improvements on characters that otherwise didn't get the time they needed. And no one better highlights this than... Of all the Yakuza 1 main cast, Yumi probably has the highest ceiling in terms of room to develop if you're doing a page 1 rewrite. For most of Yakuza 1, Yumi is less a character and more a driving force for the plot. Nishiki kills Dojima to protect Yumi from an assault, the stolen Tojo clan money is placed in the vault at Yumi's bar, and Yumi is Kiryu's first and only love that he'll pine over for the next 20 years while the series actively ignores her. She contributes to the plot, but never in a way where it's her actions. We never get to know Yumi. Even in Yakuza 0, a prequel to 1 where they have all the time in the world to develop Nishiki and Kiryu together, they go, Yumi? Oh, she's in school. We can't have her in the plot. That means we'd have to write a character for her or something. Realistically speaking, the show can only go up from here. There is infinite room to grow this character. Yet, in almost an unprecedented turnaround of the century, they took a character with next to zero characterization or agency and somehow came out with less? Yeah, I'm kinda shocked too. Okay, so for context, in Yakuza 1, a core plot point is that Yumi's long-lost sister Mizuki, that everyone's been chasing after due to the belief that she's tied to the Yakuza's 10 billion yen that's gone missing, was actually Yumi the entire time. To avoid assassination attempts on her life by her former lover Jingu, who is trying to cover up their past relationship for the sake of his political career, Yumi was given a new identity as her younger sister by Kazuma, allowing her to hide in plain sight. Which, when I say out loud, does sound like a Simpsons bit. Who is this Yumi you speak of? I'm Umi. But beyond that part of the story, there isn't a lot known about Yumi as a character. So, considering half of the Yakuza TV series is set in the past, during the Sunflower Orphan's early years, I imagine the writers had to mull over what they could do with her, as Nishiki and Kiryu had their own plotlines going on. Kiryu has his underground street fighting, Nishiki's trying to get into the Yakuza and help his sick sister, so what's there for Yumi to do? And their solution was to make Mizuki into a real character now called Aiko. Huh. It's hard to argue if this is an objectively wrong choice, but it immediately raises many questions that were solved with Mizuki being a fake identity Yumi was using. Like, where was Aiko when the rest were at the orphanage? There's a passing line that she ran away 10 years before the story, but going by how old Yumi and Aiko look during flashbacks, she couldn't have been more than a couple years older than Yumi, meaning Aiko was no older than 9 when she ran away. Not saying that isn't possible, but it raises further questions about Aiko. Why did she run away? Was she troubled? Could she not handle the trauma of having lost her parents and was acting out? Where did she go? These are questions that are never remotely answered and are problems left from making a character out of what was always meant to be a false persona. Then they also layer in this backstory where the sisters watch their mother commit suicide by walking into a lake, which doesn't add anything or affect the plot, but I had to mention it because they scored it to Mad World by Tears for Fears. Yeah. So with Aiko's addition to the plot, Yumi effectively has to split character duties. Now Aiko's the one who steals the Yakuza's money, Aiko's the one everyone's after, Aiko's the one who gets pregnant with Haruka by someone, which ultimately leaves Yumi wandering around with nothing plot relevant to do. The majority of her story is dealing with her shitty long-lost sister. But hey, now that Yumi isn't just a vehicle for plot development and gets to share actual scenes with Kiryu, maybe we can develop their relationship more. Damn. You'd think that now that Yumi is given all this screen time to share with Kiryu, we'd finally get to see a version of this character that's more well-rounded, someone we can actually get attached to. But unfortunately, a majority of Yumi's character in the 2005 plotline is spent being cold towards Kiryu, being upset that her sister sucks, and repeating how things have changed. There just isn't a character to be invested in. Despite being on screen together for much longer, I somehow believe the romance between Kiryu and Yumi way less in this version. If I were to give some level of credit, this version of Yumi isn't solely about Kiryu. It's more focused on her relationship with her new sister. You know, this is a story that has a recurring theme of brotherhood, so we have a companion storyline focused on sisterhood. I get it, I do, but there isn't a lot of meat on that bone. Yumi spends the first half of the story looking for this long-lost sister, only to find out she's awful, fast forward 10 years, repeat. But then, in a third act change of heart, Aiko takes a bullet for Yumi during a scuffle over the 10 billion yen that they were returning, because she decided she doesn't want to be trouble for Yumi anymore. For some reason. Like, I can see what they're going for here. It's a no matter what, your family's still your family and you need to take care of each other type story beat, but it's told in such a slapdash way that it's hard to feel any sort of emotion about it. They play this sad violin over this scene of Aiko finally making a selfless act to protect her little sister, and I feel all the emotion of filing my tax returns. And in possibly the biggest deviation from the source material, the story ends with Yumi still alive and kicking, leading to the question of, where do we go from here? We end off on such a fundamentally different point from the first game that the rest of the series no longer fits in this timeline. So, what now? And the answer I've come to is... hey, look, a transition! Now, if you ask me what aspect of this adaptation was handled the best, I'd have to go with the character of Nishiki. Granted, the bar is touching the floor at this point, but credit where it's due. Nishiki is meant to be Kiryu's dark foil. Same upbringing, same position, same context, but over time being corrupted by greed and ambition. This is Kiryu if things ended up a little differently. And in that sense, they do capture that part of Nishiki well. Kento Kaku does a good job of portraying both the pathetic best friend version of Nishiki, and then being able to shift into the cold, calculating older version of the character as he slicks back his hair. There are a few questionable details that I wanted to talk about though. To start, and I don't have anywhere more fitting to put this, I gotta talk about the scene. So during my first watch of the show, by the time I hit episode 2, I was already losing faith in this adaptation, and fast. I didn't like the look or feel of it, I wasn't clicking with Kiryu and all the changes that were being made, and so far it didn't have an interesting hook. But I wanted to keep going to see if it could change my mind. I mean, it takes a whole 20 episodes for Hunter x Hunter to get interesting, so maybe they could still do something cool here. But then, the scene happened. After Kiryu and Nishiki are officially brought into the Yakuza, we watch as they arrive in Kamurocho for the first time. They're having fun walking down the street, acting like big shots, arrive at their new rundown home base, get a quick montage of them sprucing up the place to make it livable, and then we end off with the girls getting dressed up for their new hostess jobs to pay off the debt they still owe the Yakuza after their heist. Now on its face, this is a perfectly fine scene. It doesn't take a brain genius to understand we're being shown the kids riding the high of being on their own, thinking they've made it now that they're part of the Yakuza, only for it to all eventually come crumbling down around them. So why do I keep referring to this scene as the scene? What is it about this otherwise normal scene that had all the hope for this adaptation evacuate my body like I just ate the whole Taco Bell breakfast menu? Well, the detail I left out was that it was scored to Mr. Blue Sky by Ela. Yeah, that one. The first time I watched this scene and heard those opening notes, I felt like I got hit by a bus. I was cackling like a madman over this. Like, no shot are they playing a Mr. Blue Sky in the fucking Yakuza show. Who scored this? Did Zack Snyder sneak into the editing bay? You couldn't think of a better way to express the main characters having a good time before things go bad than for the most cliche licensed song imaginable. I don't think I've ever used this word in a video before because it can sound pretentious, but put simply, it's hacky. And what makes this so awkward is that the rest of the show isn't scored like this. Other than the suicidal mom scene, this is the only time a needle drop like this is used, making it feel all the more out of place. The reason something like, say, Guardians of the Galaxy gets away with using a song like Mr. Blue Sky is because that's the musical identity its soundtrack is keeping to. They have a 70s, 80s music theme going on. It's consistent. But in Like a Dragon's case, it is so distinctly jarring that it tears you out of the scene completely. A scene that, I remind you, ends with Miho and Yumi doing the funny dress-up scene as they're about to be sold into sex work. I know earlier I extolled the virtues of Yakuza's ability to leverage humor against drama, and God knows this show could use some sense of humor, but this is so ill-fitting. One could argue this scene is a form of gallows humor. The girls are getting ready for a job that has insidious implications during the upbeat musical number, but to me, it falls flat on its face, especially since it's an idea they never return to or add on. It just happens and then we move on. Speaking of Miho though, that's another big change. Nishiki's sister is an actual character here. In the games, Nishiki's sister is barely a passing mention. We're told she's sick and Nishiki's trying to get the money for her medical care, but beyond that, we're never actually introduced to her, so it's hard to feel any emotion when she eventually dies. For all it's worth, she might as well be a super rare Pokemon card Nishiki's saving up for. But in the show, she's part of the Sunflower Orphanage gang. Now there's at least a character to connect to when Nishiki desperately tries to get the money for her treatment. Though it doesn't help that she's constantly firing death flags every other scene. Like, her favorite topic of conversation is how she can't wait to get married and grow old with everyone. You might as well put an obituary next to her bed. The addition of Miho also ends up feeding into another noticeable change, that being Dojima's murder. Now, instead of Nishiki killing Dojima to protect Yumi, it's an act of revenge for his sister after Dojima had a hand in her death. This is an interesting change that I generally agree with. It means that Yumi's relation to the story isn't solely as a victim of sexual assault, and it still works to show the corrupt evil of the Yakuza that the kids have fallen into. It's a clever adjustment. But it's also a change that ends up reeking of adaptation sickness, as it results in Dojima going from a vile human being attempting to assault Yumi into a 5D chess master that sees into the future. Now, this one's hard to explain without just running through the whole storyline, so real quick, in episode 4, after Kiryu is accepted as an underground fighter, Miho is taken to the hospital after a fainting spell. The doctor says her kidneys are failing and will need a donor to survive. Nishiki offers to be the donor, but is told it's not that simple. He doesn't push any further. Kiryu rushes to Dojima to start fighting so that he can make some money for Miho's medical care. After Kiryu starts dominating the underground scene, Dojima goes to Nishiki, saying he's lined up a black market organ trader for Miho, but only if he gets Kiryu to take a dive in his next big fight, one that would eventually crown him as the Dragon of Dojima. During said fight, Nishiki attempts to drug Kiryu's water, and after getting caught, pleads for Kiryu to lose the fight for Miho's sake. Kiryu attempts to take the dive, but before losing consciousness, throws a knockout uppercut that wins the match, losing Dojima his bet against Kiryu, and Miho her chance at a donor. After Miho passes away, Nishiki goes on a rampage looking for answers, as he learns that not only was he a match for Miho the entire time, but Dojima contrived the whole situation, paying off the doctors and setting up the fake black market organ trader. Nishiki then heads to the Dojima family HQ, shortly followed by Kiryu once he realizes his plan. As Kiryu is being held up by Dojima's security, Nishiki walks into Dojima's office in broad daylight and shoots him. As Yakuza swarm to the room, Kiryu rushes in and locks the door. After a brief scuffle, as Nishiki blames Kiryu for Miho's death, Kiryu ends up taking the fall for Dojima's murder, claiming Nishiki needs to keep living. After Nishiki casually walks off the premises, we fast forward to his adult years, where he has developed such a hatred for the Yakuza that he rises in their ranks so that he can eventually enact his convoluted plan to have Aiko steal the Yomi Alliance's money, all to instigate a war with the Tojo clan, while also taking on an alternate identity as the Demon of Shinjuku, a serial killer who is targeting Yakuza and Kamurocho, and carving a pentagram on their chests as a calling card. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. Now again, I have some notes. To start, Kiryu hadn't even had a proper match at the time of Miho getting sick. The only fight he had was the one to prove to Dojima that he could join their family, one where he got his ass beat for a majority of it before ending the match with a lucky headbutt that KO'd both fighters. Even if, and it's a big if, Dojima suspected he would be able to make money off Kiryu as a fighter, how did he predict that Miho would be taken to that specific hospital so that he could pay off the doctors to lie about the treatment, be able to pay them off in the time between her fainting and ending up in said hospital? Into what end? Why go through all this when Kiryu hadn't even had an actual fight yet? What 5 billion IQ plane of logic is this man working on? Second, we didn't have a better way to cause conflict than for Kiryu to throw the luckiest punch imaginable as he's losing consciousness. Really? Third, if Nishiki shot Dojima in broad daylight in the Yakuza's HQ, where someone knew he was in the room alone with Dojima, how would anyone believe it was Kiryu when he was being chased by 5 other people at the time the gunshot happened? In the original story, Kiryu can take the fall for the murder because they were in his secluded office at night with no one else around. Why would anyone think it's Kiryu in this setting when multiple people can vouch that he wasn't there? This didn't raise any alarm bells? And the final note on this, if the Yakuza believe they caught the person who murdered their patriarch red-handed right in front of them, would they really just give Kiryu over to the police to go to jail? In this moment, would they not seek retribution and just kill him? I don't have my backing yet, so maybe I'm not familiar with the nuances of the Yakuza, but I don't think Kiryu would get off that lightly in the situation that they've written. Look, I'm not usually one to pull a CinemaSins and just rattle off plot holes for the sake of it, but this flat out doesn't make sense anymore and is legitimately distracting to the story they're trying to tell. This is obviously meant to be the pivotal moment where Kiryu and Nishiki break apart. Kiryu solemnly taking his prison sentence as a form of penance for Mio dying, and Nishiki beginning his vendetta against all Yakuza. And as I'm watching what should be a sincere moment of 2 friends losing their lifelong connection to each other, all I'm thinking is, alright, so if I'm submitting as an independent contractor, that means I don't need a T4 slip, but a T4A slip? And what if I have a T4 from a previous employer that calendar year? How do I calculate that in? I think the core of this story works in terms of setting up Nishiki's motivations and bridging it to Kiryu so it will conflict, but it's a lot of changes to the source material without knowing the ramifications of how those rewrites will carry over into later scenes. This is often the hardest part of adaptation. When you're adapting something, the story you're working off of is like a Jenga tower. You can pull out certain story beats without any noticeable problems, But if you aren't careful about what you're grabbing, you might be pulling on a load-bearing block and it all comes tumbling down. Speaking of making fundamental changes and not realizing the impact it would have on the rest of the story, and so we arrive at our main character, the central pillar of the franchise, Kazuma John Yakuza Kiryu. In terms of a live-action adaptation, Kiryu was always going to be the most challenging character in the franchise to cast and portray. Not necessarily in terms of looks, though Kiryu's general physique and razor-sharp jawline aren't exactly something you see every day. It's more to do with Kiryu's persona. There's a quality to him that actors have spent decades trying to master. This stoic charisma that's hard to capture. That hard exterior that hides a soft, sincere soul that people are naturally drawn to. It's something that I can't see just any actor ever perfectly capturing, while also looking like they were chiseled from a slab of marble. Which is why I can't give Ryuma Takeuchi too much grief for not perfectly personifying Kiryu in the flesh. Especially when Amazon actively didn't let the actors play the games under some misguided idea that it would taint their portrayals. As a brief aside, I don't know why we keep doing this expecting it to work. I have no idea where this thought of, don't look at the source material, you might develop opinions about the character you're portraying, originated. Why do you not want your actors researching the roles they're playing? It's like telling a James Bond actor they can't watch the previous 007 movies to prepare for the role. It's genuinely baffling. But tangent aside, to his credit, Takeuchi did a respectable job with the material he was given. Based on what I've seen of Kamen Rider Drive, I know he can perform well. It's just a shame the material he was given wasn't enough. This is where my issues stop being about the technical or the structural, and more the emotional. Kiryu is the soul of the Yakuza series. He may not always be the central focus or the most important character in a given story, but he's the one the world is viewed through. In this sea of insanity and violence and intrigue, Kiryu is meant to be the rock that holds everything in place. He is designed to be the moral compass that shows the idealized image of how a Yakuza should carry themselves. Honorable, respectful, surprisingly good karaoke skills, an all-around pillar of the community. And that's where Like a Dragon: Yakuza flat out fails for me. Kiryu often feels like an afterthought in his own show. In the 1995 storyline, he spends a large portion of it training to be an underground fighter for the Yakuza. We already talked about why that's a weird take, which doesn't have a satisfying conclusion on its own, and is mostly used as a form of contrived conflict between him and Nishiki. It also doesn't feed into the 2005 storyline, as Kiryu spends most of that just walking between scenes with Yumi until he needs to fight Nishiki. There isn't a lot for him to do or say. We never get any sort of reflection on how all this impacts him. There's never any emotion driving these scenes. If anything, it kind of feels like they didn't want to tell a Kiryu story. Which is fine, we've had multiple stories where Kiryu isn't the main character, but then don't put him on the cover. Where Kiryu in the games feels like a sturdy rock in a sea of insanity, the show Kiryu is best described as a dead body being dragged along a lake of averageness. To put it in even blunter terms, I don't think they made a bad Kiryu. I think they did something far worse. They made a boring Kiryu. There just isn't any sense of a strong character here. And that's largely because this Kiryu is mostly built from the scaffoldings of the first game's Kiryu, but is missing all the foundations. All the characters that are meant to help us better understand Kiryu either aren't present in this version, or just don't make sense anymore. Take Date, for example. The detective who ruined his entire career in law enforcement because he was certain Kiryu didn't kill Dojima. By his logic, Kiryu was about to become the head of his own family. Why would he shoot Dojima over a petty fight about money like Kiryu claimed? The pieces didn't add up, so Date became obsessed with figuring out what happened. And after Kiryu gets out of prison and finds himself being thrown into a race for the missing 10 billion yen, he ends up teaming up with Date to solve the mystery, thus starting a lifelong connection between the two. But in the show, these pieces no longer connect. Kiryu is no longer a notable Yakuza within the organization. He's a step above being a nameless goon. So why would Date ever question the validity of Dojima's murder? And if there is a reason, we never get that because the jumbled up timeline means we're introduced to Date after he's already become acquaintances with Kiryu while he's in prison, and then ropes him into the investigation of the missing Omi clan money and satanic serial killer. And this results in the constant overhanging question, why does this police detective give a shit about Kiryu? There isn't a reason why these two need to work together. There's no standing relationship. There's nothing Kiryu can contribute to this investigation, especially when they already know who stole the money. It feels like the writers are already working from the conclusion that Kiryu and Date are already friends because that's how they've been written for the last 2 decades, and then never work to justify it within their own fiction after making changes that inevitably conflict with that. The only reason it isn't more noticeable upon first watch is because the story is told in such a disjointed manner, you sort of expect that eventually they'll explain their relationship, but it never comes. Also, minor nitpick, but this Date is egregiously negligent regarding his job. He allows a full-scale gang war to happen in front of him and does literally nothing until it's already over. The logic implied is that this is a let them fight moment, saying a Yakuza problem requires a Yakuza solution, as Date hopes both Yakuza factions will simply kill each other off. But aside from the fact that isn't how law enforcement should work, this isn't some abandoned area of town away from prying eyes. This is in the middle of Kamurocho, a very populated part of Tokyo. Shouldn't you do something to protect the citizens in the district? Even his own officers are like, why are we letting this happen? All I know is my Date would never allow this. Then on the flip side of Date, there's Haruka. If Kiryu is the soul of the Yakuza series, then Haruka is the heart. Haruka's role in the first game, and the series as a whole, is less about how she directly influences the plot, but how she influences our protagonist. Kiryu and Haruka are the classic grumpy dad, adopted daughter trope in games. They're arguably the first. Essentially, Haruka is meant to be the manifestation of Kiryu's lost innocence after going to jail for all those years. And throughout the series, you see the lengths that Kiryu is willing to go to ensure Haruka can live happily after all the trauma she endured, even if it's to his own detriment. So much of the tragedy of Kiryu's character is that all he wants is to live a quiet life of solitude with Haruka and the rest of the orphans he's helped raise, but is constantly pulled away from them due to his past mistakes with the Yakuza, often choosing to keep his distance out of fear for the trouble he might bring. These are frequently the moments that you get to see the sincerity that Kiryu has beyond the intense, brooding exterior. But for all I can say about their relationship in the games, there is literally nothing in the show. I'm not even being hyperbolic about this one. When early cast listings for the show came out, there was a notable absence of Haruka's name, leading many to assume that she wouldn't be in this story. But now that we've seen the show proper, that might as well be the case. Kiryu and Haruka share a grand total of 1 scene together, one where there isn't a single word exchange between them, and then nothing after. For how much she impacts the story, Haruka might as well be considered a glorified cameo. It's like seeing a bizarre alternate reality where Kiryu immediately found Haruka's mom, gave her back, and then moved on to other adventures without her. We could have cut the character entirely and not missed anything. And with that, we arrive at the last stop of the disappointing secondary characters tour, Shintaro Kazuma. This is honestly the one that hurts the most because it's the one that has the most potential. If you were going to do a Yakuza story sans Haruka, then the next best place to go to understand why Kiryu is how Kiryu is would be his adopted father, Kazuma. Frankly, Kazuma should be a central figure in telling a story about Kiryu's origins. This is Kiryu's Uncle Ben. In the first game, Kazuma is a presence that is constantly felt hanging over the story, but you never quite learn about. We know he's Kiryu's adopted father, we know he's a high-ranking Tojo clan member due to his work as a hitman, And we know he opened the Sunflower Orphanage as a sort of penance for the parents he killed as a Yakuza by taking in their orphan children. An interesting concept for a character working with these details, but beyond those key features, he's a bit of an enigma. And this is where the show starts off on an intriguing note. Rather than maintaining his status as a high-ranking Yakuza where he can control the scene, the Kazuma we see here is more reserved. One who's already left the Yakuza life behind and simply wants to run his orphanage in peace. If they wanted to show Kazuma who truly regrets the deaths he caused while being part of the Yakuza, and is just trying to make amends by keeping his kids safe, this is a great place to start. And initially, I thought they would go in the direction of exploring Kazuma and Kiryu's relationship within this framing. Kiryu starts off hating his adopted father, but as they spend time together with Kazuma teaching him how to fight, a connection starts to form. Okay, I think we can genuinely do something with this. This is a great place to explore their dynamic, flesh out their relationship a bit more. Now, where do you go from here? No, there's no way. How do you have so many characters who provide nothing? There's so much room to do anything interesting with these characters you're interpreting, and nothing happens. There's no character development. There's no plot development. I feel like I'm going insane. Look, I get it. This is the first season. All of my complaints could be hypothetically addressed in future seasons, and then I look like a whiny baby. There's always potential for a show to shake off its season 1 woes while it discovers its voice. But this should be a hook to keep me invested in those potential future seasons. This should be the sell for why I should care about what these characters go through in this adaptation. Not a holdout for, maybe they'll do something with these characters eventually. Take Arcane for example. Arcane Season 1 tells a complete story, front to back in its 9-episode runtime, with payoffs for all its plot threads and characters it's established, then leaves off on a cliffhanger that will tip the scales of the entire setting we've gotten to know that the following season will then go on to explore. Meanwhile, in Like a Dragon: Yakuza's final moments, in the least shocking reveal ever, Kiryu discovers that Kazuma was the original Dragon of Dojima, and was the one who killed his and Nishiki's parents. This should be a huge character moment between Kiryu and Kazuma, either positively or negatively. If they develop their relationship at all, this would be the emotional climax of the season that recontextualized their family's whole history together. But this reveal only matters if you've built up these relationships. If you're going to put so much emphasis on this moment that you use it as the cliffhanger of the season, you need to make me care that that reveal has happened. The drama of this scene hinges on if I care about the lasting relationship between Kazuma and Kiryu. And considering they shared 0 scenes after Kiryu got out of prison, it's hard to say that I should. As it stands, I feel like it's a reveal solely for the sake of needing a season 1 cliffhanger. A setup for a season that I doubt we'll ever get. After finishing the series, I was just left feeling bummed. Despite all my bitching and moaning, I was genuinely hoping there'd be something to this series. Something that made this worth existing within the Yakuza franchise. I was more than willing to give this show as much leeway as it needed in making changes if it was in pursuit of telling an engaging story or adding an interesting perspective. But I was not getting that experience. And as I sat there, staring at the end credits of the final episode, it got me thinking about another adaptation. Takashi Miike's Like a Dragon film was released to mixed reviews when it first came out in 2007. Throwing you right in the middle of the first game's plot without any setup, the movie has many of the same shortcomings as the first Yakuza game, being made only a year earlier. Kiryu isn't particularly well developed, a lot of time is spent between Kiryu and Majima's fight across Kamurocho before finally getting back on track to the main plot in the movie's last third, and Yumi appears for the first time right at the end before exploding.
I'm a guy. Thank you, whoever.
What?
It has all the trappings of a so bad it's good movie that you watch late at night with friends over Discord. If we're being totally objective, it is also not a great adaptation of the Yakuza series. But I still have a blast watching it. Miike's interpretation of Kamurocho is infectious and charming. The movie is less focused on retelling the story of Yakuza 1 beat for beat, and instead, Kiryu and Haruka's story is just one piece of the insanity that is Kamurocho on this one hot summer night. All the minor plot threads throughout the movie could just be sub-stories that Kiryu never agreed to pursue and continued to go on without him. 2 bumbling bank robbers in a standoff against the police, a young couple who find themselves going on a crime spree, and a host club helping out a Korean assassin who's there to take out Nagoshi. It's a ridiculous whirlwind tour throughout Kamurocho, capturing the absolute absurdity that the Yakuza series is known for. The movie was released only a couple of months after the second game was released, and yet it somehow feels prophetic of what the series would evolve into. Before his fight with Nishiki, Kiryu literally drinks stamina and spark to build Heat Meter. How could I not enjoy this movie? And upon further reflection, I was left wondering about the difference between this movie and the series I just watched. While one felt like an absolute death march by the end, and will likely be forgotten as soon as this video's over, the other is one I will continue to go back to for years after. Neither of them is a perfect adaptation of the material, but there is one that I would wholeheartedly recommend over the other. So, why is that? The simple and easy answer is that Miike's film is just fun to watch. I've shown this movie to multiple friends, and we always have a fantastic time. The ways it adapts certain aspects of the games and even forecasts future ideas, it's hard not to get pulled along into its sheer lunacy. Where Amazon's adaptation takes itself so seriously and fails to land it, this is a celebration of what was enjoyable about Yakuza from the beginning. It might not reflect the emotional stakes of Yakuza at its best, but it does maintain the spirit, and that's what matters most to me. However, I think the answer goes a bit further than my personal fondness for cheese. There's a certain emotion missing from Amazon's retelling that is oozing from Miike's film. Put simply, it's sincerity. A sincerity that's always been at the heart of the franchise. Earlier in the video, I talked about how when Nagoshi and his team were making the first Yakuza game, they were taking a real risk. While I might have my gripes with how it came together and the holes left in the story due to its production, there's also a clear earnesty in what they made that makes it hard not to fall in love with the series. There's a reason that the first game was able to build up into this beloved franchise that millions around the world continue to follow. It was something that was made because someone had a vision they wanted to create, a vision they were willing to take a gamble on. There was a passion driving that project, a type of passion I just blatantly don't feel in this show. And that's probably the most damning thing I can say at the end of this whole thing. Oh, also Majima's in the show. There really isn't anything more to say than he's wrecking Saijima's junk in this scene. Yeah, that's about it.